Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. On the morning of August 15, 1945, Japan became a nation suspended between breath and silence. In homes shattered by firebombing, in factory ruins, on military bases from Hokkaido to Kyushu, millions leaned toward their radios as static swirled like dust in the air. Then the voice came soft, trembling, and unmistakably imperial. It was the first time ordinary citizens had ever heard their emperor speak, and his message rippled through the country like a cold wind. The war was lost. A world built on sacrifice, obedience, and unbroken will had ended in a single solemn broadcast. Across Asia, the announcement did not arrive as sound, but as rumor. Soldiers hidden in Burmese jungles or entrenched along Chinese rail lines heard whispers from local villagers long before any officer dared repeat the news. Some men read the surrender from leaflets dropped by American planes. Others watched stunned commanders struggle to translate the emperor's archaic language into something their troops could bear. The meaning was undeniable: lay down. Your rifles, cease resistance, surrender. For soldiers of the Imperial Army, the word carved deep. Since boyhood, they had been taught that surrender was not failure, but spiritual annihilation. Manuals preached that dying with honor was the final duty of a warrior. Capture was a stain that would shame your ancestors and cast dishonor on your descendants. And now the emperor himself, the living core of that ethos, commanded them to accept the unimaginable. Some soldiers stared at the dirt beneath their boots, as though the ground had betrayed them. Others searched the sky for answers that were no longer there. In China, entire divisions felt the collapse like a sudden plunge. Command posts fell silent. Battle flags that had once been guarded as sacred relics now fluttered uselessly against broken walls. Guerrilla forces surrounded outposts before Japanese officers could even finish reading the surrender aloud. Veterans who had fought for years found themselves without orders, without direction, and without a nation capable of reclaiming them. The empire had not retreated, it had simply stopped existing. On the islands of the Pacific, disbelief hardened into refusal. Troops isolated for months, surviving on coconut water, and routes listened to American loudspeakers announcing Japan's defeat. Most assumed it was a trap. Even when search teams approached waving white flags and speaking flawless Japanese soldiers melted deeper into the foliage, convinced reinforcements were coming and that the emperor would never abandon them. For these men, surrender felt like a lie designed to lure them into death. In some garrisons, despair erupted in its rawest form. Hardened officers, unable to reconcile loyalty with surrender, took their own lives. Young conscripts wept inside bunkers that smelled of mold and cordite. Entire platoons sat in stunned silence, their identities severed from the military structure that once gave their lives meaning. With a single broadcast, the imperial machine, once rigid and all-encompassing, disintegrated. Communication lines were destroyed. The Navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific, and the government had no power beyond what the Americans allowed. Across Asia, Japan's armies realized they were stranded not because they lost a battle, but because the empire itself had vanished beneath them. As night settled on August 15th, an unspoken truth swept through every outpost, bunker, and garrison. The war had ended, but the fate of millions of Japanese soldiers was only beginning. Some would go home, others would be marched into Soviet camps, and a few would simply disappear into jungles where the war would continue in their minds for decades. The empire had fallen silent, and its soldiers now stood on the edge of a long, uncertain road, one that no map had ever prepared them for. Across the vast territories Japan once controlled, surrender did not arrive as a single clean moment, but as a slow unraveling. In cities like Singapore and Manila, the once mighty imperial banners still hung from garrisons whose commanders had not yet received confirmation of defeat. Communications were shattered. Telegraphs had gone silent. Radios hissed with static, and couriers never returned from missions swallowed by collapsing front lines. The empire had stretched itself across seas and continents, but in its last hours, it no longer had the strength to speak to its own armies. The destruction of the Japanese Navy made the isolation even more brutal. The fleets that had once carried soldiers, ammunition, and food across the Pacific now rested on ocean floors or lay beached in ruined harbors. Without ships, entire divisions in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia were cut off from the homeland. In the Philippines and New Guinea, men already surviving on roots and rainwater realized there was no rescue coming. The ocean that once empowered the empire now served as an uncrossable moat around its abandoned soldiers. In mainland Asia, the collapse was violent and immediate. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria, once considered the pride of Japan's military, disintegrated almost overnight as the Soviet invasion surged across its borders. Units that had trained for years were overrun in days, their commanders unable to form coherent defenses or even deliver the news of surrender. Refugees clogged the roads, civilians fleeing in every direction, while Japanese soldiers retreated in confusion. The line between civilian and combatant dissolved into chaos as men tried to decide whether to fight hide or simply wait for fate. In China and Southeast Asia, local resistance movements sensed the empire's weakening grip. Guerrilla forces struck outposts, sabotaged rail lines, and ambushed isolated patrols that no longer had centralized protection. Japanese soldiers who had once governed through fear now found themselves surrounded by former subjects who saw an opportunity to reclaim their land. Rumors spread of towns where entire garrisons were wiped out by militias before formal surrender orders arrived. For the soldiers trapped in these regions, it felt as though the ground beneath them had turned hostile in an instant. On Pacific Islands, the sense of abandonment took on an even harsher shape. Many units had not received supplies for months before the surrender their survival, depending on foraging, improvised fishing, or raiding local plantations. When word of defeat reached them through leaflets dropped by Allied planes, the men stared at the messages with disbelief. Some officers burned the leaflets, declaring them enemy propaganda. Others gathered their troops and confessed quietly that the war might truly be lost. The soldiers listened without speaking, caught between hope for rescue and fear of dishonor. The dissolution of command structures created a vacuum that no one knew how to fill. Captains without directives sat in empty headquarters, trying to rewrite purpose into the ashes of defeat. Sergeants kept their men drilling out of habit, even as the sound of marching boots echoed pointlessly across abandoned courtyards. In some places, soldiers simply walked away from their posts, drifting into forest villages or mountain passes in search of a path home. In the midst of this unraveling, a haunting truth settled over the empire's far-flung remnants. They had been left behind not because they failed, but because the empire itself no longer existed to claim them. The nation they served had collapsed inward, leaving its armies scattered like shadows across continents. As night fell on camps, jungles, mountains, and ruined garrisons, soldiers sat in silence beneath foreign stars, their uniforms worn thin, their futures unknown. The war had ended with a broadcast, but for the men stranded across Asia, the real ending was this being alone in a world that had already moved past them. When the American occupation forces began organizing the return of Japanese troops, the scale of the undertaking was unlike anything in modern history. Ports across Asia filled with columns of thin, exhausted soldiers waiting to be processed, each carrying a small bundle of belongings that represented years of war compressed into a handful of memories. American doctors inspected them quickly, making notes of injuries, infections, and starvation. For many Japanese soldiers, this first encounter with the enemy revealed a strange truth. The men they had feared for years were now treating them with a professionalism that felt disorienting. Repatriation camps sprang up in places like Manila, Singapore, Okinawa, and Saipan, each one operating like a vast machine designed to move men from war back to civilian life. Soldiers lined up to receive vaccinations, delousing powder and ration kits, the procedural rhythm replacing the chaos they had endured during the empire's collapse. Some stared in silence at the food handed to them by American personnel, unsure whether to accept it with gratitude or shame. For men trained to believe that surrender stripped them of honor, the simple act of taking bread from a former enemy carried its own quiet weight. At sea, the journey home became a liminal passage between two worlds. Allied transport ships, some still bearing scars from wartime engagements, were converted into vessels of return. The decks creaked with the movement of thousands of men who leaned against railings and watched the horizon shift from tropical blues to the colder, muted colors near Japan. Conversations were sparse, carried by wind rather than voice, as soldiers wondered what awaited them on shores they had not seen in years. The sound of waves striking the ship's hull became a kind of metronome for their uncertainty. As the first outlines of Japan appeared across the water, The returning soldiers felt the weight of anticipation twist into something deeper. Smoke rose from factories being rebuilt. Cranes swung above partially restored docks. American jeeps patrolled the piers in structured lines. The country they left had been a militarized empire. The one they returned to was silent and occupied. Soldiers paused at the gangplank, some gripping the railing as though steadying themselves against the unfamiliar sight of their own homeland. Disembarkation brought the harshness of reality into focus. Reception centers were overcrowded with makeshift bedding laid across warehouse floors and classrooms, repurposed into temporary barracks. Winter winds slipped through the broken windows of buildings damaged by firebombing chilling men who were already weakened. American overseers attempted to organize the process with efficiency, but the emotional strain of returning to a ruined homeland overshadowed any logistical structure. Some soldiers sat quietly in corners, staring at walls that reminded them of barracks from years earlier, as if time had folded back on itself. For many, the greatest emotional shock was reunion with family. During the war, the Japanese military often reported captured soldiers as killed in action to preserve the illusion of honorable death. Families held funerals, burned incense, and placed photographs on household altars for sons and husbands they believed had died far from home. When these men walked through their doors alive, the reaction was a collision of joy, disbelief, and grief. Mothers fainted. Children hid. Wives cried silently, torn between relief and the pain of remembering the years spent mourning a man still breathing before them. In the shadow of occupation floodlights, the men came to understand a painful truth. Returning home was not the end of their struggle, but the beginning of a new battle, one fought in memory silence, and a nation reborn without the empire they once served. Home had survived the war, but it had become a place they no longer recognized. Their path forward would be shaped not by commands or mission objectives, but by the difficult task of rebuilding themselves in a land that had changed beyond recognition. In August 1945, while most of the world believed the war was over, a storm gathered over Manchuria with a force so sudden that it shattered the last illusions of Japanese control. The Soviet Union, having declared war on Japan only days earlier, unleashed one of the fastest and most devastating land offensives in modern military history. Tank columns poured across the borders like a steel tide, followed by infantry trained for brutal rapid advances through any terrain. Japanese outposts, already weakened by years of supply shortages, had no time to mount a coordinated defense. The Kwantung Army, once the symbol of Japanese might in Asia, collapsed almost immediately. Commanders had spent years preparing for a different kind of war, one fought at a slower pace, with time to mobilize reserves and redeploy units. Instead, they were overwhelmed by Soviet mechanized assaults that smashed through their positions before radio messages could even be transmitted. Entire battalions were cut off in minutes, their defensive lines sliced apart by tank brigades that moved with terrifying precision. Soldiers who had expected a final stand found themselves surrounded without even understanding how the enemy had reached them so quickly. Capture came swiftly and without ceremony. Japanese soldiers, exhausted and disoriented, were rounded up in columns and marched toward assembly points under Soviet guard. Many carried only their rifles and a single bag of possessions. Others had lost everything in the chaos and walked with empty hands. The Red Army offered little explanation, simply ordering the men into trucks trains and makeshift holding areas. The soldiers sensed that whatever awaited them would be far harsher than the structured repatriation happening under American oversight elsewhere in Asia. The transition from battlefield to captivity was brutal. Prisoners were herded into overcrowded cattle cars where there were no seats, no ventilation, and barely enough room to stand. The air grew thick with heat and human breath as the trains began their long journey north. Food was scarce, water scarcer, and stops along the route brought only brief moments of relief before the doors slammed shut again. For many, the journey itself became a second battlefield fought in darkness and desperation as men collapsed from exhaustion or illness. As the trains crossed deeper into Soviet territory, fear took root among the prisoners. They peered through cracks in the wooden walls and saw landscapes growing colder, harsher, and more desolate with each passing hour. Snow began to fall, even though it was still late summer, signaling the severity of the winters they would soon face. Some soldiers whispered prayers, others remained silent, gripping the metal bars until their knuckles turned white. The farther the trains traveled, the more the men understood that they were not being transported temporarily. They were being taken to a place where time itself seemed frozen. When the trains finally arrived in Siberia, the prisoners stepped out onto a land that felt like the end of the world. Rows of barracks stood under gray skies surrounded by fences, and guard towers manned by expressionless sentries. The cold bit into their bones, instantly a sharp contrast to the humid summers of Manchuria. Soviet officers barked commands and divided the prisoners into work groups with little explanation. The soldiers realized that they had crossed from collapse into captivity, a new chapter of hardship that would test them in ways the battlefield never had. The fall of Manchuria marked more than a military defeat. It was the moment the empire's illusion of control dissolved entirely. The Japanese soldiers taken in this final offensive did not return home in the months that followed. Instead, they vanished into a system designed to consume labor resilience and identity. As night settled over the Siberian barracks, the men huddled together for warmth, staring at the distant glow of guardhouse lamps flickering through snow. The empire had died in August, but its soldiers now faced the beginning of a winter without end. The men stepped into Siberia as if crossing into another dimension where the landscape itself seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. A brutal wind cut through their thin uniforms, carrying the sting of a winter that arrived early and never seemed to end. The ground was frozen solid, as lifeless as hammered steel, and the sky hung low with heavy gray clouds that sealed off any sense of direction. The prisoners knew instantly that they had entered a world where survival depended not on courage, but on a relentless grinding patience. Their barracks were long wooden structures hastily built decades earlier to house political prisoners. Inside rows of stacked bunks lined the walls stuffed with straw that reeked of mold and sweat. The heaters rarely worked, leaving the rooms icy even at night, and frost formed on the edges of blankets before dawn. Dozens of men slept shoulder to shoulder, not by choice, but by necessity, sharing body heat because the cold was capable of freezing exposed skin within minutes. Sleep, when it came, felt more like slipping into a numb trance than true rest. Work assignments determined a man's fate. Some were sent to logging camps deep in the forest where they chopped trees for 12 hours a day with blunted axes. Others labored on railroads, hauling steel rails and smashing frozen earth with pickaxes that shook their bones. A smaller number were forced into mines where the air was thick with dust and the tunnels echoed with the sound of collapsing rock. These tasks pushed the men to the edge of physical collapse, and those who lagged behind were often kicked back into line by guards who viewed exhaustion as weakness, not reality. Illness swept through the camps like a second winter. Frostbite darkened fingertips and toes, turning skin black before it peeled away. Dysentery weakened even the strongest bodies, leaving men unable to stand during roll call. Those who fell ill were taken to the infirmary, a dimly lit building where Soviet nurses shaved their bodies to prevent lice and examined them with clinical detachment. The humiliation cut deeply, but many prisoners admitted later that the nurses, though cold in demeanor, provided the only real medical care they received. In the infirmary's quiet halls, they saw the thin boundary between survival and death. Diary fragments from survivors reveal the interior landscape of their thoughts. One soldier wrote that he stopped counting the days because each one felt identical, a blur of snow work and aching bones. Another described the cold as a living creature that slipped under clothing and curled around the spine. A third wrote of watching the sun set behind the forest, its brief light fading into the long Siberian night, and feeling as though time itself had frozen alongside the rivers and lakes. These writings survived not by chance, but because the men hid them beneath floorboards or inside the linings of their coats. Despite everything, one truth held them together: the belief that someday, somehow, they would return home. Rumors of repatriation moved through the camp like flickers of warmth. Men whispered at night about lists being created, about transport trains preparing to move south, about negotiations between governments far away. Most of these rumors were false, but they gave the prisoners something essential: hope, in measured doses, just enough to survive the next day. Hope was the only rations the Soviets could not control. On certain nights, when the guards retreated to their posts and the wind momentarily softened, the prisoners stepped outside to look at the stars. The sky above Siberia seemed impossibly vast, a black canvas scattered with points of light that shimmered like distant memories. They stood in silence, breathing out clouds of white vapor, imagining that somewhere beyond the horizon, their families were staring at the same sky. In those moments, the camp felt less like a prison and more like a winter that the men refused to surrender to, no matter how long it lasted. In the Siberian camps, time lost its shape. Days repeated with the same ritual of waking in the cold, lining up for roll call, and marching toward labor sites under the watch of armed guards. Seasons were the only markers of change, winter's suffocating grip loosening into a muddy spring, then a short summer that felt more like a pause than a reprieve. What struck the prisoners most was not the monotony, but the growing awareness that the world beyond the barbed wire was shifting rapidly while they remained frozen in place. News from Japan arrived in fragments. Guards mentioned elections, new constitutions, and factories reopening. Soviet officers occasionally read official announcements about political reforms and economic reconstruction. These words felt unreal to the prisoners who imagined their homeland transforming into something they could barely recognize. The Japan they remembered wooden houses, familiar shrines, crowded markets felt increasingly like a memory from another life. Rumors filled the void where certainty should have been. Some men whispered that their families had assumed them dead and held funerals years ago. Others heard claims that returning soldiers were treated coldly by civilians who blamed them for defeat. These stories deepened the sense of separation between the prisoners and the nation they longed to return to. The longer they remained captive, the more they feared the Japan waiting for them no longer had a place for who they had become. Labor remained relentless. Prisoners cut timber, built roads, and repaired rail lines that stretched across the endless Siberian horizon. Men collapsed from exhaustion only to be pushed back to their feet by guards unmoved by fatigue or suffering. Yet amid the harshness, small acts of compassion surfaced, a guard slipping an extra crust of bread into a man's hand, another letting prisoners warm themselves near a boiler for a few stolen minutes. These gestures did not soften the reality of captivity, but they reminded the prisoners that humanity could survive even in the coldest places. Friendships grew into lifelines. Men who had never met before the war now depended on each other to endure the long winters. They shared scraps of food, protected the weakest during inspections, and whispered stories of home to keep despair from settling too deeply. In the quiet moments after evening roll call, someone might hum a folk tune from his village, and the sound would fill the barracks with a warmth the frozen air could not steal. As the years dragged on, the prisoners aged far faster than the calendar suggested. Their hair grayed early under the weight of endless winters, but beneath the physical wear, a quiet resilience took root. They had endured cold hunger, forced labor, and a separation from home so long it felt like exile inside another lifetime. Each day they survived was an act of defiance against a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Sometimes during rare breaks in work, prisoners walked to the edge of the compound and stared at the endless plains stretching beyond the fences. Snow glittered beneath pale sunlight, and the wind carried their breath into the vast, empty sky. They imagined the mountains of Japan or the narrow streets of their childhood towns. For a moment the silence felt peaceful, as if the land itself acknowledged their longing. Night brought a stillness so deep that even the guards' footsteps seemed distant. Lying in their bunks, listening to the faint groan of timber contracting in the cold, the men realized how many years had slipped through their hands. And yet somewhere far to the south, they knew their homeland continued to turn, rebuilding, redefining, and moving toward a future that seemed just out of reach. In that darkness, they held on to the quiet hope that Japan had not forgotten them, even if the world around them seemed intent on moving on. When the Siberian prisoners finally began returning home, they stepped off the ships into a nation they barely recognized. Japan's cities, once framed by wooden neighborhoods, shrines, and narrow lanes, now stood amid scaffolding, concrete foundations, and the charred skeletons of bombed districts. American military police directed traffic at intersections lined with signboards in English, while cranes rotated above construction sites, humming with a new rhythm. The smell of cement lingered in the air, replacing the old scent of incense and tatami. For the returning veterans, every step onto the dock felt like stepping into a different century. The occupation had reshaped the country in ways that left many of them disoriented. School children recited lessons from new textbooks that celebrated democratic ideals instead of imperial destiny. Newspapers printed articles about civil rights labor movements and constitutional reforms, concepts that felt unfamiliar to men whose education had revolved around obedience sacrifice and the emperor's will. Even the role of Shinto had changed, stripped of its connection to state power and reborn as a private faith. Veterans found themselves unsure where to anchor their identities in a Japan determined to shed the very ideology they had once been ordered to defend. Finding work became its own quiet struggle. Industrial reconstruction was underway, but employers favored young civilians with modern training over men whose skills were forged in jungles, trenches, and prison camps. Factories hired veterans as laborers, lifting crates, repairing simple machinery, or clearing rubble from bombed-out districts. Rural soldiers returned to farm villages where elderly parents had endured the worst years of wartime rationing. They worked the fields alongside them, grateful for the familiarity of earth beneath their hands, yet unsure how to rebuild a life that had been paused for so long. Psychological wounds lay beneath the surface of these everyday routines. Many veterans woke at night drenched in sweat, jolted by memories of cracking ice collapsing tunnels, or the shouts of guards echoing through distant barracks. Some froze at sudden noises, their bodies conditioned by years of survival. Families noticed the moments when a man's gaze drifted into silence, pulled toward memories he rarely spoke of. The society of the time had no vocabulary for trauma, no frameworks for healing, so these reactions were tucked away behind polite smiles and quiet apologies. Pain was folded carefully into the fabric of daily life, yet moments of reconnection softened the sense of displacement. Childhood friends, now teachers, shopkeepers, or clerks, welcomed them with warm embraces and shared memories of simpler days. Local festivals returned after years of dormancy, filling neighborhoods with lantern light, the beat of taiko drums, and the smell of grilled food. Veterans stood at the edges of these gatherings, watching children dance under banners fluttering in evening breezes. These scenes offered quiet reassurance that not everything had been lost, that the cultural rhythms of Japan still held space for them somewhere. Despite the country's rapid transformation, loneliness followed many veterans like an unseen companion. Some avoided discussing the war entirely, afraid of judgment or misunderstanding. Others remained silent because their experiences defied the vocabulary available to them. They carried memories of hunger, cold battles, and captivity that did not fit easily into the bright narrative of Japan's reconstruction. These memories became private landscapes visited in silence after work shifts or on long walks at dusk. Over time, the veterans carved out a quiet but steady place within Japan's rebirth. They helped rebuild cities, guided younger workers, raised families, and watched their nation grow into an economic power. Yet within their hearts, they carried the unspoken truth that peace had been bought with scars that would never fully fade. They were men shaped by a world that no longer existed, holding memories that lived between the lines of Japan's new story. And at night, sitting on tatami floors below the soft glow of electric lamps, they felt the past settle around them not as something to escape, but as something that had shaped them in ways the world would never fully see. By 1946, as veterans staggered back into a Japan under American occupation, the country faced a reckoning larger than any battlefield. Courtrooms were built inside former military academies, their floors still scarred by boot heels and training drills. Microphones, cables, and translation booths filled the chambers where the Tokyo trials would decide the legal and moral legacy of a collapsed empire. Civilians lined the streets outside, newspapers in hand, waiting to understand what crimes had been committed in their name and what justice might look like in the ruins of defeat. Before the first witness took the stand, one truth hung heavily over the proceedings, a truth many Japanese had not fully confronted. The Imperial Army had committed atrocities on a scale that scarred Asia for generations. From Nanjing to Manila, from Korea to Burma, the empire waged a war defined not only by military ambition, but by brutality, forced labor massacres, systemic torture, and medical experimentation. Telling the story of Japanese soldiers after the war did not erase these crimes. It simply revealed another layer of a tragedy that touched millions. Inside, the courtroom testimony unfolded with quiet devastation. Survivors described villages, burned camps, where forced laborers died by the thousands, and experiments performed in frozen rooms that echoed with human suffering. Interpreters raced to keep pace with the torrent of detail, turning pain into words that could be entered into the record. Documents recovered from abandoned headquarters revealed policies that had turned cruelty into an administrative system. For ordinary Japanese veterans, the trials forced a painful confrontation between what they had personally experienced and what the war truly had been. Many remembered moments of kindness, sharing food with civilians, treating prisoners humanely, protecting villagers, and struggled to reconcile this with the evidence presented before the tribunal. Others recalled the unspoken rules of the battlefield: avoid questioning orders, avoid discussing strategy, avoid understanding too much. They had been instruments of an ideology they never fully grasped. Across Asia, satellite trials held in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Manila brought lower-ranking officers and soldiers before Allied tribunals. Japanese veterans returning from these regions often passed courthouses where their former comrades were escorted inside in shackles. The reversal of power was stark. Men who once commanded fear now entered courtrooms gaunt, silent, and resigned. For many veterans watching from the outside, it felt like witnessing the final collapse of the world they once served. The trials reshaped Japan's memory as profoundly as any battlefield had reshaped its geography. Newspapers debated accountability. Schools rewrote curriculums. Public forums invited survivors to speak directly to Japanese citizens for the first time. For veterans rebuilding their lives, this cultural shift was disorienting. They carried trauma-hunger scars, frostbite, and memories of lost comrades, experiences that rarely appeared in the legal narratives of guilt and responsibility. Yet as painful as the trials were, they became a turning point. They allowed Japan to confront its past, not with denial, but with the slow, difficult work of reflection. Some veterans wrote memoirs acknowledging the suffering inflicted under the empire. Others attended reconciliation events or visited former battlefields to meet the families of civilians who had survived Japanese occupation. These moments did not erase the past, but they planted the seeds of a future rooted not in conquest, but in understanding. In that moment, the veterans understood an uncomfortable truth. Their lives were now tied not only to what they had survived, but to what their country had done. The trials had not condemned them personally, but they had drawn a boundary around the past, one that Japan would spend generations learning to navigate. And as the veterans disappeared into the night streets of Tokyo, their shadows stretching across wet pavement, the weight of history followed closely behind, not as an accusation, but as a reminder that the end of war is never the end of its consequences. Across the scattered jungles of the Pacific, the end of the war did not arrive as a broadcast or a formal surrender. It arrived as silence. For months, and in some cases decades, small groups of Japanese soldiers continued to operate as if the empire still stood following orders that had long ceased to matter. These holdouts moved through dense forests and narrow mountain passes, convinced that every rustle of leaves concealed enemy patrols. The war had ended elsewhere, but in their minds the battle remained suspended in time. One of the earliest and most haunting stories was that of Corporal Shoichi Yokoi on Guam. When American forces retook the island in 1944, Yokoi and his remaining comrades retreated deep into the jungle, living in burrows dug beneath tangles of roots. Over the years, the small group dwindled until Yokoi alone remained, hunting eels at night and crafting tools from bamboo. He refused to believe leaflets announcing the war's end, assuming they were psychological tricks. His survival became a routine shaped by fear discipline and a loyalty that was unwavering even in solitude. Yokoi's world shrank to a single rhythm: wake at dusk, forage through shadows, retreat before dawn. He stitched clothing from bark fibers and avoided cultivated fields to prevent leaving footprints. The jungle became both shield and prison, its rustling foliage replaced by the steady hum of insects that marked the passage of seasons. When he was finally discovered by two local fishermen in 1972, he emerged from the undergrowth like a ghost of a vanished empire, thin-weathered and clutching a handmade spear. His first words expressed sorrow not for his suffering, but for returning alive, a confession shaped by the shame he carried. Lieutenant Hiru Onoda's story unfolded with even greater complexity. Stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines, Onoda received orders to continue guerrilla warfare and to never surrender under any circumstances. After Japan capitulated, Onoda interpreted every attempt to reach him, leaflets, loudspeakers, even letters from family as enemy deception. Alongside 3 fellow soldiers, he raided fields, fired warning shots at locals, and retreated into the mountains whenever pursued. As the years passed, his companions were killed or surrendered, leaving Onoda alone in a shrinking battlefield defined by memory rather than strategy. The psychological landscape of Onoda's world hardened with every passing year. He believed the empire still existed, that the Americans sought to mislead him, and that his duty as an officer had no expiration. When a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki finally located him in 1974, Onoda listened carefully but remained unconvinced. Only when his former commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, now a bookseller long retired, arrived with written orders formally relieving him of duty, did Onoda accept that the war had ended. He stepped out of the jungle carrying a polished rifle that still functioned, its metal preserved with meticulous care. Other holdouts surfaced under equally extraordinary circumstances. Private Teruo Nakamura, a Taiwanese conscript of the Imperial Army, was discovered on the island of Morotai in 1974. Having lived in a crude hut hidden within dense vegetation, Nakamura endured storms, hunger, and the constant weight of isolation with few tools and no companions. His survival relied not on military training, but on the instinctive resilience of someone determined to remain unnoticed. When rescuers finally approached him, he stood quietly among the trees, unsure whether the world he remembered would recognize him as Japanese Taiwanese or simply as a man forgotten by history. Each holdout returned home to a Japan radically different from the one they had imagined. Crowds greeted Yokoi Onoda and Nakamura with curiosity that bordered on disbelief, as if they were living relics from another century. Television cameras followed their every move, turning their stories into national spectacles. Yet beneath the public fascination lay deeper tensions. These men embodied a Japan the nation had largely moved beyond, one defined by rigid hierarchy, absolute obedience, and an unshakable belief in duty. Their return forced the public to confront a past that was easier to forget than to reconcile. For the holdouts themselves, reintegration was a journey as challenging as their survival. Yokoi struggled with the fame thrust upon him, carrying quiet guilt for not dying in battle. Onoda, still governed by discipline, moved to Brazil for several years to escape the contradictions of modern Japan. Nakamura faced bureaucratic disputes over his identity and compensation, highlighting the complexities of an empire that had once claimed him but no longer existed. Each man learned to navigate a society shaped not by war, but by economic growth, new cultures, and shifting values that felt foreign to their wartime memories. As years passed, the holdouts faded from public attention, living quiet lives shaped by routine and reflection. But the image of their jungle shelters' rifles preserved in oiled cloth, and eyes that had learned to scan forests for threats, lingered in Japan's collective memory. Their return marked the final echoes of a war that had already become history for most citizens. And in the quiet moments before sleep, many veterans imagined these men still navigating dark jungle paths, carrying out missions issued by a world that no longer existed, guided only by the dim and unwavering light of duty. By the 1950s and 60s, Japan rose from the ashes with a speed that startled the world. Neon lights flickered across Tokyo's rebuilt streets, replacing the dim lanterns of the occupation years. Bullet trains sliced through mountains once crossed only by footpaths. Factories hummed with relentless energy as the nation reshaped itself into a modern powerhouse. Yet beneath this new brilliance lived a generation of veterans whose memories belonged to a different Japan, one of rice paddies barracks, jungle trails, and the echoes of a war they could never fully leave behind. These men carried landscapes their families would never see: the frozen rivers of Siberia, the jungles of Burma, the ruins of Shanghai, the cliffs of Saipan. They remembered not just places but sensations: a Siberian cold that felt like a living creature pressing against their bones, a jungle silence heavier than artillery, the weight of hunger that blurred the edges of thought. These memories shaped them long after uniforms had been folded away. Yet the Japan they returned to had little room for such stories. People wanted progress, not reminders of the war's long shadow. As the nation surged into its economic miracle, many veterans moved quietly along its edges. Younger workers embraced Western fashions, jazz music, and American films with an enthusiasm that felt alien to men shaped by wartime austerity. Baseball stadiums filled with cheers where military drills had once echoed. Department stores rose over districts that had been firebombed into blackened rubble. Veterans watched the transformation with pride and disorientation, caught between admiration for Japan's rebirth and a subtle ache that the version of the country they had known was vanishing beneath concrete and neon. For some, the war became a private weight carried behind daily routines. They repaired bicycles, hammered nails into new homes, swept factory floors, or tended quiet gardens in backyards. They bowed politely to neighbors who never knew what they had endured. They rarely spoke of the war, not out of shame, but out of a desire not to burden those who had already suffered enough. At night, when the world was quiet, memories drifted back like cold wind through an unsealed doorframe. They held cups of tea that trembled slightly in their hands, waiting for the past to fade back into silence. Others sought to preserve what time threatened to erase. They wrote memoirs in careful handwriting, filling notebooks with stories of lost comrades, the bitterness of captivity, and the quiet gratitude of survival. They gathered in small reunion groups, speaking in low voices shaped by shared understanding. These meetings were not celebrations, but small sanctuaries where unspoken memories could exist without explanation. In their conversations, the war remained vivid, something alive carried within them like a fading but still warm ember. As decades passed, the veterans aged into a quiet presence on the margins of a rapidly modernizing society. Their hair whitened, their steps slowed, and their voices softened, but the past remained vivid inside them. Some visited memorials carved with the names of fallen comrades, placing flowers beneath stone tablets warmed by the afternoon sun. Others stood alone on hilltops or beside rivers, gazing at landscapes that seemed unchanged, even as the world around them transformed beyond recognition. They were not longing for war. They were remembering the parts of themselves that had been left behind in its wake. By the turn of the 21st century, the wartime generation had become a dwindling thread woven into Japan's larger story. Their memories lived in documentaries, family photo albums, museum exhibits, and the stories told in quiet kitchens during winter nights. Japan continued to evolve new industries, new cities, new generations who knew war only through textbooks and films. Yet beneath this forward momentum lay a foundation shaped by those who had endured hunger, captivity loss, and the collapse of an empire. In their final years, many veterans found peace in small, ordinary moments, watching snow settle on temple rooftops, listening to wind bells chime in summer breezes, or holding the hands of grandchildren who lived in a world they had once believed unreachable. These moments offered a gentle closure that no trial monument or government decree could ever provide. They contained no bitterness, only the quiet understanding that they had been the bridge between a Japan defined by conflict and a Japan defined by peace. And when the last of these men passed away, their uniforms folded neatly in drawers and photographs resting on family altars, it felt as though a lantern had finally gone out. Their stories of cold and courage, of despair and stubborn survival became echoes held by descendants who never knew the full weight of their endurance. Somewhere in a small Japanese home, a faded uniform hangs untouched in a darkened closet, its colors muted by time. A thin strip of morning light catches its fabric, illuminating the final witness to a world that has vanished forever.